Thank you for tuning in to the Mouse Book Club. Mouse Books takes classic literature and makes it mobile. Our books are carefully crafted and scaled down to the size of a cell phone, so you can carry them with you anywhere. We believe reading great books expands your mind and liberates your soul. And to help make these works even more accessible, we offer a free audio version of each book, as well as a podcast of our in-house book club. This week, the Mouse team discusses The Dead by James Joyce.
You teach by asking questions, and mastery of the material consists in large part of being able to ask questions that matter, So the homework that I assigned to the group was to just pick a passage. This is what I do with any book club group that I might run, or any class session. If you're in my class and we're reading a novel and you had to read a chapter last night, step one is identify a passage and look at language, because often book clubs, one of the stereotypes about book clubs is that they come in and say, I hated this character because this character cheated on his wife, and my husband cheated on me 3 years ago, and suddenly we're not talking about the text anymore. Yeah. You make the connections to life, but it begins with language. It begins with the text. So that's why I raise that point first. What is something about the text that stuck out to you?
I can go.
Okay.
Well, I had one funny one that I just thought was funny, where it was just made me laugh when he's on Gabrielle's doing the carving before the dinner, and then it's like the quote, now if anyone wants a little more of what vulgar people call stuffing, let him or her speak. I thought that was pretty funny, just in terms of like humor. But that was just a funny thing. But when Gabrielle goes into his like speech at the table about hospitality, I thought that was really interesting. That was kind of my favorite thing about this tradition of hospitality.
I mean, one of the interesting things that, and I'm not deeply familiar with Joyce, but it seems like he does bring in a lot of Irish culture into his work. You say that's accurate?
Yeah, there's a quote that I can look up while we're talking. He says something like, the goal of my art is to forge the destiny of my race in the smithy of my soul, or something like that. Everything is about Ireland for him. So the Dubliners, which is the collection of short stories, which this concludes. This is poignantly, tellingly the final story in the collection. But many of the stories, all the stories take place across the stratosphere of Dublin culture. But in many of the stories, characters are talking politics and music and theater, as if like. Imagine if we wrote a collection of short stories about like Marvel Comics and Justin Timberlake and Donald Trump, and then somebody tried to read it in a foreign country 100 years from now. It's so globalized. I mean, the question doesn't really match up. But so many of the cultural references can bounce off you if you're not familiar. So you kind of have to let them roll.
One of the things that I picked up on, or was kind of pointed out to me by somebody else, that they just keep talking about feet again and again and again, especially at the beginning of the story.
Like with the
galoshes. Yeah.
Well, but even like the very first line of the book that's like on the cover, like Lily, the caretaker's daughter, was literally run off her feet. And it seems like every other paragraph for like the first half of the book is all about, there's a lot of references to. That's
interesting too, because it talks about like the sound upstairs, like the kind of pitter patter or whatever on the, like as he's downstairs and he hears everybody, the women upstairs.
Well, I'll throw in the scene that I chose. It's only 2 paragraphs. Should I read it quick, or do you just want me to talk about which scene?
I think it helps actually to point us to it and read it, and so we can kind of see the language through your eyes,
Okay, so it's on page 34, and it's right after everybody breaks and leaves, and then Gabriel's kind of dressed and ready to go, but his wife's not there. And so Gabriel had not gone to the door with the others. He was in a dark part of the hall, gazing up the staircase. A woman was standing near the top of the first flight, in the shadow also. He could not see her face, but he could see the terracotta and salmon pink panels of her skirt, which the shadow made appear black and white. It was his wife. She was leaning on the banisters, listening to the music. Gabriel was surprised at her stillness and strained his ear to listen also. But he could hear little save the noise of laughter and dispute on the front steps, and a few chords struck on the piano and a few notes of a man's singing voice. He stood still in the gloom of the hall, trying to catch the air that the voice was singing and gazing up at his wife. There was a grace and mystery about her attitude, as if she were a symbol of something. He asked himself, what is a woman standing on the stair in the shadow, listening to distant music, a symbol of? If he were a painter, he would paint her in that attitude. Her blue felt hat would show off the bronze of her hair against the darkness, and the dark panels of her skirt would show off the light ones. Distant music, he would call the picture, if he were a painter. And so, after really connecting to what this story is all about, I came back to this passage, and literally, I find it crushing and embarrassing. And in fact, I had my wife read it at breakfast yesterday, and I almost started crying when she read it, because it reveals the incredible arrogance and vanity of Gabriel, and how he sort of views everything in the world as sort of orbiting around him and as seen through his perception, and how you totally miss, once you understand what she was actually doing and what was going through her mind, through her soul, then you realize he took something that was really, really beautiful, an event that was really, really beautiful, and instead of asking about what is she thinking about, or trying to connect with that, he just turned that whole subject into his own property, through creating a scene that's his painting. And the shortest sentence in this whole book is probably, it was his wife. It's almost like a possessive sentence. And I just feel you can be so close to something, you can even sense that there's something magical about a situation. But if you're totally selfish about the way that you process it, then you can miss something that's really important to somebody else.
His wife is a stranger to him. He doesn't recognize her when he sees her. It takes him a moment. So when we see it was his wife, that's him thinking that thought. The kind of realization. I mean, we have moments like that in our lives where we don't realize that it's our beloved until they're up close to us. But it's completely fitting with the theme. The distance, the emotional distance.
David, I want to riff on that for a second, because I actually highlighted that passage as well, not actually communicating with you beforehand. And I connected in kind of a sad way with Gabriel, part of my the way that I used to see the world. And I just want to say one thing about that particular passage, which is that he sees this beautiful image of his wife, but he then tries to make it even more beautiful in his own mind by thinking about it as a painting. Paintings are much more if I were a painter, he says, I would paint her in that attitude. I would sort of encapsulate this beauty, and I would be the one kind of manning the brush, holding the brush, being able to sort of, boast almost about the beauty of this moment and his ability to recognize it and capture it as an artist. It seemed very selfish and very clueless, essentially. So I really, listening to you talk about it, it really hit me in an even more impactful way.
The emphasis in that passage is on his own cleverness. He would be, he's the aestheticizer, mm-hmm. right? And it connects, ironically, to his speech, which is one of the passages that I highlighted as well. he opens his speech by talking about hospitality, but then he makes a rhetorical pivot. I'm on page 28, and he says this. He sort of ingratiates himself with the audience by talking about traditional hospitality, but then he says a new generation is growing up in our midst, a generation actuated by new ideas and new principles. It is serious and enthusiastic for these new ideas, and its enthusiasm, even when it is misdirected, is, I believe, in the main sincere. But we are living in a skeptical, and if I may use the phrase, a thought-tormented age. And sometimes I fear that this new generation, educated and hyper-educated as it is, will lack those qualities of humanity, of hospitality, of kindly humor, which belong to an older day. Listening tonight to the names of all those great singers of the past seemed to me, I must confess, that we are living in a less spacious age. Those days might, without exaggeration, be called spacious days. If they are gone beyond recall, let us hope, at least, that in gatherings such as this, we shall still speak of them with pride and affection, still cherish in our hearts the memory of those dead and gone great ones, whose fame the world will not willingly let die. So here's Joyce, the young modernist, writing a passage about the advent of modernism, which many might regard as a thought-tormented age. Modernist art is a thought-tormented art. It's completely conceptual. If you think of Joyce's other works, such as Ulysses and especially Finnegan's Wake, his reputation is for being impenetrable and inaccessible, except by elites, right? And that's a reputation he cultivated actively. So Gabriel is talking about the problems with this generation, but this is exactly the kind of attitude that he has toward the world. He's a thought-tormented person. He dwells too heavily in his headspace. He's an intellectual person, and even the very first passage that you pointed out, Courtney, at the beginning, where he expresses a sense of scorn for the vulgar terms that people use for food. He's trying to distance himself from his relatives in terms of his interests and affect. So these passages are all connected for me in terms of this Joyce's interest in moving from the headspace to the heart space.
And I think what's interesting is that he's caught in his head, like you said. He lives too much in his headspace, and when it comes to his emotions, he thinks about it too much. Like, he overthinks it, and so like towards the end, when he's having the conversation with his wife, he's like, there's this like really kind of sad line where he says, or this is actually Joyce's narration, Gabriel felt humiliated by the failure of his irony and by the invocation of this figure from the dead, a boy in the gasworks. So it seems like he tried to overthink this. In a way that feels so, for me, like so real and true in my own life and in the people I see around me who try to use their mind rationally to understand some of these like more ethereal emotions, like love or pain or suffering or loss.
Yeah, I think you can call it over-intellectualizing, but it's also he over-identifies with himself, with his sense of self, right? So like, for example, I'll be in the shower and suddenly rehearsing whatever like piece of political ammunition I'm going to give to some colleague at work that day, and I kind of catch myself saying, why do you need to be known as the guy who was able to make that observation? Or, so the headspace is also the ego space, and Gabriel can't let go of his sense of himself. He's nothing without his cleverness in his own mind. He doesn't identify with his culture or his family members. He's able to speak. Even when he's rehearsing the speech, he says, "Oh, these people are too dumb to get the references that I'm going to make to poetry and so forth." Right. So he struggles with that.
It seems like his interaction in the beginning too with is it Lily? When he is having an exchange with her, and she has that kind of comeback that shocks him. about about kind of, I guess he's kind of saying basically she's going to go off and get married or whatever, and she has that. I'm trying to find that passage, but it's kind of shocked.
He tries to crack a joke about her future, and she gives him an honest response. It's not a It's not a performance of identity, but rather she doesn't feel that she has to play along with his irony.
Yeah,
that connects a little bit back to the Irish culture and how like every conversation is basically a knife fight with wit, you know.
Right.
One thing I'm really curious about. Has anybody read this before, or is it the first time reading this for everybody?
First time for me.
First time for me. First time for Ted.
Yep.
It's been since college.
How did the reading of it change for you? What was it like to read it a second time?
I think one of the key aspects of reading literature is mindfulness, being able to catch everything, right? And to be constantly aware of the rhetorical dynamics of the piece, like what is the narrator or author trying to accomplish at every moment. And then, of course, you bring your own sense of judgment and your own experience of life to it, you know? So when I read it when I was 20 years old, I wasn't a deep feeling person. Or at least I was a deep feeling person about things that happened to me and not to other people. So you kind of you go with what your professor or your teacher tells you to go with. It's like, well, you know, clearly he's making a statement about being spiritually alive and spiritually dead. Here are all the references to Irish culture. Here's the context of Joyce's career, which is significant, right? But not until here we are, over 10 years after college for me, and it's like that core. Well, I read differently now too, even after the PhD. You know, when you read as a scholar, you read opportunistically. You look for things that are going to help you make your articles and get you where you need to go. But just reading as a sensitive person, everything looks different now.
Did you have more sympathy for the characters generally?
Yeah, definitely. Because to echo what Ted said, a previous version of myself was scornful of small talk and simple worldviews and like boring everyday life. Mm-hmm. You know, I recently. Have any of you ever done the Enneagram?
Yes.
Yeah.
No,
so
that is.
It's like a religiously or spiritually oriented personality test. It's like a day-long retreat that you do, multiple days really. But one of the big takeaways for me is that the type of person that I am really needs to be special, and to be regarded as being special or better than other people, and that's Gabriel's issue right here, and that's also Joyce's issue. He wants to embrace and critique Irish culture at the same time. But he's no fan of small-mindedness. At least that's what we think of when we think of Ulysses. It's like, whoa, it's so difficult. But the great power of Ulysses is that it captures day-to-day life and refreshes it with language that we've never seen before. So Ulysses is only one of 3 books that I've ever wept while I've read because of moments of incredible pathos. So we have to kind of be mindful of what kind of self-image Joyce is trying to cultivate, and then what actually comes across in the books.
There's something else about that, though. Like, there were parts of this book, and I think a lot of readers are going to experience this, where it was really boring, you know? And you're like, man, this is really tedious. And the ending, I went into it knowing that this story has one of the great endings in all literature, you know? And, you know, I had to remind myself a couple of times that, look, Joyce isn't the one with the problem here. If it's like, you got to trust like a great author. You got to, like, I saw Branford Marsalis, the musician, talk about this, the great jazz musician, talk about this in respect to music, that like Stravinsky, Tchaikovsky, even Beethoven and Mozart, that music doesn't necessarily just come to you. Like, great music doesn't come to you. You have to come to it. You have to understand it. And I think reading something like this isn't going to be as entertaining as reading a Atlantic article, or as reading a news article. It's not meant. It's functioning at a different speed, and I think that it can feel like almost working out to a degree. Like, you're exhausted mentally trying to get through it, but then at the end of it, there's like a reward waiting. Does anybody else have that feeling?
Yeah, definitely. I think because I knew of Joyce just because of high school, and because I went to art school, so it was limited in terms of like an English class or literature classes. But so I was, the Ulysses, James Joyce is like this like Mount Everest of books. So I was kind of going into it was a bit intimidated of just, how deeply of a read was it going to be, and how much would all the little symbolism and kind of inside things, that because I know he just goes deep with that. But it was more readable than I had thought, I guess, just because of kind of my preconceptions about what reading Joyce was like. But at the same point, like, I really appreciate, Brian, you're talking about kind of how this fits into Joyce's work, and like just the symbolism and these like kind of other layers of reading. Like, I kind of felt like when I was reading it, like that there was all this like inside stuff that I was missing just because I wasn't of that time or living in Ireland, that there were like nuances of things that were kind of going missed.
Well, I would add too that like if some student would come to us say, yeah, well, the ending is great. Why not just cut out everything before the final scene when Greta and Gabriel are alone and just start there? It's really powerful. It's a really powerful scene, very emotional. Why not start there? But I think for me that when you review the whole story, people are talking about the past and about the dead throughout the story. And even Gabriel's speech is a speech about how we should talk about the dead. Do we offer platitudes? Do we feel deeply? It's a story about our sense of contact with the people who've gone before. And the final sequence is highly imaginative, because there's no more language to be spoken in a story that's so saturated with talking. But in a moment of silence, the last words that Greta says, I believe, are, "I can still see his eyes," right? And then she starts. So she doesn't conceptualize the past. She doesn't interpret the past. She encounters it face to face every day. And Gabriel, when he looks out the window, he starts to see visions of the people who've gone before. So it's a move from the space of language and talking and identity posturing and ego into an experience of the spiritual world. So you need all that stuff to get where the story gets you.
Yeah, I felt that that the story was kind of like painfully slow, like evolution can be painfully slow. Like, it just takes a really long time for this like thing to happen, even though it was one evening. But because the evening felt so drawn out, and like all these small little changes that were happening to mostly within Gabriel's sort of worldview at the time. But he gets to a place at the end where, well, for one, he confronts himself in the mirror, which is really, really interesting. He passes across and catches a glance at himself in the mirror, and it's the face whose expression always puzzled him. And I mean, what I found so really beautiful about the way this ended was that I actually I identified with Gabriel, like in the beginning and in the middle, and then towards the end, like I had this amazing amount of empathy toward him as a person, because it felt like he was tormented, like he was kind of suffering in this day, in this experience, this situation. It was him kind of realizing what his faults or limitations to like really feeling deeply were. I mean, he says like that, something about like that maybe that's what love really is. Or like, here it is. He had never felt like that himself toward any woman, but he knew that such a feeling must be love. So he like, he confronts himself with like something really, really profound, and then it just ends and it gets cut off. I felt really, I wanted to just keep reading. It was a very strange ending for me. Like, I'm not sure what else to say there, but I was just like, oh, like he had just kind of hit a point that was building up the entire time.
Well, a new question will be, how will he interact with Greta in the morning? Will he return to the safety of his ego and his posture, or is he going to be transformed?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating how he comes in contact with essentially these visions of the dead, and like almost like the spiritual weight, and it almost like sort of takes him, and how he might respond to that in the morning. He might go back to where he was the day before, but I feel like something has stretched in him, like something has changed a little bit, and maybe he's already experienced this before, so it's hard to tell. He's experienced this sort of awareness of himself and the kind of folly that he lives through life with.
And he can't, if you look at the way that sequence is narrated, he can't, we see him being increasingly unable to contextualize this moment in his default ego setting. He cannot find a clever response that disarms or dissolves the emotional intensity. That's what he's looking for, but it only increases toward the end, and he cannot find a mental stance that is comfortable to deal with it, and it becomes something new, something unknown.
It's interesting when it connects back to like the speech he gave about kind of lamenting the loss of hospitality, but then at the next kind of moment, this like idea of like, that's the past, don't dwell on it, kind of move on. So it's kind of like to your question of like, will he be changed the next morning? It's like, if he follows his own earlier advice, maybe not.
Yeah, that speech has a 3-part structure. He praises hospitality, then worries about losing hospitality, and then says, right, well, we need to look toward the future. Yeah.
One of the things I was curious about was what exactly the device of the snow was intended to represent. And after the conversation, I just sort of flipped to the end of the book, and I was looking at the last sentence, and his soul swooned slowly as he heard the snow falling faintly through the universe, and faintly falling like the descent of their last end upon all the living and the dead. And the idea that the snow was general throughout Ireland, and it was just kind of like almost like a character. And I think it's interesting to think about these ideas that transcend like life and death. And
could I just build on David on what you're saying? Like in the beginning, doesn't Gabriel walk in and there's that moment where he's got the snow on his jacket? Brian, is there any like connection with the snow kind of at that moment, and then how that leads to what happens in the end?
Well, yeah, I mean, a good teacher will have you go back through the story and look for every reference to snow. My curiosity is if this is a climatological anomaly. I'm not sure that it snows very much in Ireland. So would the guests have, they kind of do, treat it as a remarkable event, right? And they talk about galoshes, a new piece of technology. One of the characters doesn't know what galoshes are, right? So there's something already unusual about the night. I might be totally wrong because I don't know about Irish climate. Does anybody know?
Brian, I just checked. I literally just put into Google how often does it snow in Ireland, and it literally says here that snow is not a feature of the Irish climate. Temperatures hover around 5 degrees Celsius in January. I mean, many snow sometimes on the peaks, but not really in the ground in Dublin. So,
and not over the entire country all at once.
Right.
So for a reader of that time to encounter this detail, they might interpret it as being a somewhat magical occurrence.
Yeah, I mean, and there's also a short passage that I had picked out as like an alternate that I wanted to read, which was Gabriel looking out the window, and in the narration he says, "How cool it must be outside! How pleasant it would be to walk out alone, first along by the river and then through the park. The snow would be lying on the branches of the trees and forming a bright cap on the top of the Wellington Monument. How much more pleasant it would be there than at the supper table." And I really now that we're kind of coming around to this snow being almost magical and kind of out of reach or something like that, it's quite interesting to think about how Gabriel like comes in contact with this image and it floats through his mind, and then immediately like he goes back to his speech.
I think it's kind of like the observing it Greta on the stairs, though. Like, he doesn't really understand what it is. He's taking it through his own lens. He's treating it as like something to give him a cheap thrill. He's not recognizing its magical nature within the story.
Yeah, I mean, he doesn't run out into the snow and do that. He kind of romanticizes it.
He's supposed to be the head of the table giving the speech, and all he wants to do is get away from all these suckers, you know? I don't know. I find it another sort of arrogant aspect of his self-esteem.
He interprets it through the question of what can he get out of it?
He has
what can it do for him? Yeah.
Narcissistic personality disorder.
Having read this, do you think this is a good first book for this endeavor? And if so, why?
I think totally yes, because it has many elements, including like the necessity to read it again, to go back over it and to catch kind of, it has layers and the language is really beautiful. But beyond that, I feel like an immense sense of sort of like criticism of life and the opportunity to build empathy around an idea that might be familiar to you personally.
What do you think, Courtney? Were you satisfied with this being Mouse number one, basically?
Yeah, I think this is something probably it wouldn't have even been on my radar to pick up and read. But it's one of those things that like the richness of reading it, like to your point about like, you could read other things that were more entertaining, but it's kind of like I feel more enriched for having read it, and also just even having this discussion like has been really, really helpful, and like kind of teasing out the complexities and some of the deeper meanings. Like that's been really helpful.
I also think it's like making Joyce accessible. I think that a lot of us, even all of us on the call, with the exception of Ryan, are like intimidated.
Yeah, totally. I was definitely in that camp.
Well, I think people will be surprised by how easy it is to read. It's not difficult to read. It's just like it has an extremely long scene that tries to account for every detail of the scene. So it's mysterious rhetorically, where a reader says, why are these guys who's doing this startup and they want us to get really excited about reading, giving us a boring story right off the bat? And so there's a requirement to think on that level, not just what's happening in the story, but why this choice? And that's one of the questions in the back of the book. And I think this choice activates it, because Joyce is a name that people recognize. He has a distinct reputation as being difficult. So there's a sense of rigor, but you have to earn the payoff in this story, and that's what we're looking for. It's not a quick hit. It's not a confirmation bias. It's not a tweet that makes you feel good about your self-righteous position in the world, you know? So yeah, it hits.
Our program was produced today by Theodore Eccleston and myself. Thanks to the Mouse team, including Editor-in-Chief Brian Chappell, Design Director Courtney Garvin, Business Development Leads John Shetland and Chris Motley, and our dear friend Crystal Zobish. Please visit our website, mousebookclub.com, to get your hands on some of these hot little books. And remember, the best way to get Mouse is to subscribe. Sign up, and we'll send you a year's worth of Mouse right to your door. While you're at it, why not subscribe to this podcast? I'm Dave Duane, back next time with more action from the Mouse Book Club.